Again, welcome, and my name is Regina Langhout, and our webinar is called 2 Years Later, How the UCSC Community Psychology Research and Action Team and its graduates still strive to embody ethical, critically reflexive, anti-racist feminist praxis. And so what we're going to do is I am going to share my screen with you so you can see this is our title. And I'm just going to put up a quick outline here for a moment so that you can see we're going to start with some introductions. Then I will give a quick summary of the paper. And then David will talk about changes and similarities from a grad student perspective. Then we'll talk a bit about carrying the work forward in new contexts. And Danielle and Erin will share from where they are now, which is that they're both assistant professors now at different places. And then we'll have plenty of time for discussion. And I won't leave this outline up here the whole time, but we do want to start with introductions. So why don't we go ahead and do that? And please remember when you're not speaking to mute yourself so that we can hear the person who is speaking clearly. And so let's go ahead and get started. So again, my name is Regina Langhout and I'm at University of California at Santa Cruz, and welcome to everyone.
Hi, good morning. My name is David Gordon. I'm also at University of California at Santa Cruz. I'm a graduate student there.
Hi, I'm Danielle Kohfeldt, and I'm an assistant professor at Cal State Long Beach.
Hi, I'm Erin Ellison, and I'm an assistant professor at CSU Sacramento.
Hello, everyone. I'm Tiffany Jimenez. I'm an associate professor at National Louis University in Chicago.
I think we have one more person on the webinar as well, but maybe they've stepped away. So
oh, sorry. My name is Delina Bailey. I'm a student, graduate student at National Louis University.
Miria, would you like to introduce yourself?
I don't think she has her audio connected yet.
Okay, well, welcome. We see you.
Hello.
Or at least I see you. Okay, so I will go ahead and reshare our outline here. Oh, sorry. Oh, and now, okay. All right, so what I'm going to do next is just give a quick summary of the paper just to get us all on the same page and remind us what the paper is about before we move into David. And so in this paper that we wrote, what we really wanted to focus on was the core competency listed in community psychology of an ethical, reflective practice, and our desire to shift this core competency. I'm trying to set a timer for myself. There we go. Okay. And how to shift this core competency to something that focuses more on a critically reflexive, anti-racist feminist praxis. Because reflexivity has not transformed the research or the researcher, according to some community psychologists such as Likes and Crosby. And the reason for this may be because when we just think about a reflective practice, that doesn't necessarily include relatedness. So our amendment brings relatedness, social positioning, and liberatory practices into the core competency in a much more explicit way. And we thought that that was really important, along with, of course, the anti-racist and feminist part that we have brought in. That, again, I think was implicit, but we've tried to make it more explicit. So then in the paper, we talk a bit about how our research team was organized, the Community Psychology Research and Action Team at University of California, Santa Cruz. And so this team started meeting when I was a brand new assistant professor at UC Santa Cruz. And the program that I was brought into was a PhD program in social psychology. And so what I recognized from the beginning is that the graduate students in our program didn't necessarily have a space structurally to get a strong foundation in social community psychology, although they were getting a strong foundation in social psychology through the introductory pro-sem courses that students take in their first year. So the way that we organized was I had our undergraduate research assistants, our graduate students, and me meeting together. And so part of this so that we could build that common theoretical foundation that brought community psychology into what we were considering, but also so I could think more about social psychology and how to sit more at that boundary of social and community psychology. And the other reason was to reduce the hierarchies that we have that are part of the academy and part of many workplaces. And so in the third year of us meeting, the graduate students came to me and asked for their own space due to tensions and needing a different space for professional development. So the way that I think of this is that it took about 3 years for us to really solidify that sort of common framework and understanding. And at that point, it was really time for the graduate students to move on to something new and different in terms of where they were developmentally with their own professional development. So then what we did is we went ahead and we changed the structure, and I started meeting with the graduate students weekly, so without the undergraduates, and the graduate students then would meet with the undergraduates separately. And they were already doing that before, but now the only time really structurally that the undergraduates were meeting was with their graduate students that they were, with whom they were working. And so what we did is we had a structure where we meet for an hour and 45 minutes weekly. And the first hour is spent in a combination of personal check-ins, and that's where any of us can talk about anything that we desire, and also project check-ins. And so that's when we would talk about our individual projects and describe any challenges or anything going on. And we do that in a group also because we recognize that everybody has expertise to bring to the table, and that those meetings shouldn't just be between the person leading a particular project and me. And so then the last 45 minutes is spent by whomever signs up to take that time for whatever it is that they find most useful to them. So it's sometimes me who signs up, sometimes it's graduate students who sign up, and it could be anything from I need more support in my writing. Can we spend the next 45 minutes, all of us sitting in a room and just writing? To graduate students wanting professional development help around maybe coding and coding schemes, in which they might ask me to do a lesson on that. Or it might be a graduate student saying, hey, I have some ideas for my second year paper. I want to talk through them. Or a graduate student might say, hey, I'm having a really hard time decoding this paper that seems really central to my dissertation. I want all of us to read it and talk about it. So it can really be whatever it is that that person, the only requirement is that that time be useful for the person who has signed up for that time. And so what we do then in that, so that's our structure. What we do then is we do our best to understand the space and practice it as heterarchy. So Jack Teebs talks about this in some of his work. So the idea then is instead of a hierarchy, we might still have some hierarchy, but it's hierarchy that is hopefully more agreed upon by all members, and it shifts over time. So the idea here is that there are moving parts and everybody has expertise, and the people who take the lead at any one given moment are those who have the most expertise on that particular topic. So then with that, there are two examples that I'm just briefly going to go over. One is the way that we spend our personal check-in time. So in the paper, we talk about how we talk about our bodies, and we see that as a transgressive act that resists our bifurcation and helps us keep in touch with our situated selves, so that we can bring our entire selves into academe and into the process, especially given that these spaces weren't necessarily built for working class, working poor students, students of color. So that helps us to be more whole. And then the second example we talk about is pulling on the strengths of the research team when we need them to get a project back on track. So this is one where we had a new graduate student who had a lot of expertise in something called positive discipline. And so the idea there is that we were having some challenges with our youth participatory action research project. And so we brought in her, and we brought in some of the former graduate student supervisors and me to really think through how we could restructure that space to be more productive for everybody in that space. And so that is our brief summary. And what I'm going to do is just reshare where we are in the outline. And then, so we're here now. David's going to talk about his perspective as somebody who was in the space when we wrote the paper and continues to be in the space now.
Hey everybody, how's it going? So yeah, it's been interesting over the last couple of years just to see how my positionality has changed, and I guess the way that I'm situated within this space. And the biggest thing that stood out to me when I was thinking about this is that the space has changed because the people have changed, which sounds like a very idiosyncratic way to say that. But the reason that I say that isn't necessarily that, people have come and gone, which is true, but that it's been more readily apparent to me the ways in which identity is fluid and the ways in which we try to incorporate that into our space, and the way we try to consider that. So, for example, at the time of the paper, I was just starting my third year, and at that point, I'm still trying to figure out my space within the academy, within academia, and what it meant to be a black man in grad school when academia wasn't built for me or people like me. And the getting in process didn't stop at the application. So I had applied, I'd been accepted, but I still wasn't in terms of my understanding of being in grad school and what it meant for me personally. So being able to bring in my positionality and see my positionality valued and talk about things from my personal life, the purpose that it served at that point was helping me figure out this space. Now, as time has gone by, I'm no longer a black man trying to figure out how to get into the academy. Now I'm a black man trying to figure out how to get out of the academy. And I don't mean that in a pejorative sense. What I mean is that I'm trying to take these lessons, these things that I've learned and things that I've shared with people in this space and extend it to my career after grad school as that begins to get closer and closer. And so the way that the conversations flow for me personally have shifted, and I've also seen that for other students as time passes and as their role within the lab passes, that there's a fluid shift of identity in terms of what it means to be a grad student in that space. Part of that means what it is that I can give to the space and what I've seen other grad students and what I've seen Gina bring to the space as time has passed by. Again, to use myself as an example, when I first joined, and really actually for maybe a couple years after that, I was very reticent to contribute, and that wasn't necessarily just the newness, but I felt that my positionality was valued and that I was an important part of this space, but I didn't really feel that my perspective was needed to shape the space, if that makes sense. I didn't necessarily feel that I didn't feel like an expert, I guess would be the best way to put it. But as time has gone by, I've seen myself not only as being valued in the space, but being an integral part of shaping that space and contributing to the democratic production of knowledge. And I think that it's important that our space gives room for those shifts over time, and it gives space for people to pace themselves as necessary as they feel more comfortable contributing to that space. The other thing that I've noticed in the space of time since we wrote this paper is recognition of fluidity identity outside of the space, so not just as a graduate student, but my relationships and my personal community, my family. And as those things have changed, the ways that I navigate the boundaries of graduate school and my life outside of graduate school have also changed. And I think it's important that those conversations have been allowed to continue within CPRAC. My family, as you see, has grown since the paper. My responsibilities have shifted, and that's an important part of I guess, being critically reflexive about what my role is within the space and my role is within academia. And then the last thing that I'll say before I close out is that while all of us in some way, all of the students in the lab have worked with Gina on some level, shape, way, or form, I appreciate the flexibility of the lab in terms of membership. So we have had other space in terms of membership because we have had people who have other advisors who still attend our meetings, and that flexibility and the focus on shared values and a shared construction of the space has been valuable in terms of incorporating more of an interdisciplinary approach to what we're doing and acknowledging different forms of expertise. And that's where I'll go ahead and close out.
Great, thanks, David. And we just so you know, we could all understand you, but you sound a little like, I don't know, digitally. So maybe what I can ask you to do before the discussion starts is to jump off and then jump back on so that when we move to the discussion, we'll be able to hear you more clearly. And thank you for that. And that was nice for me to hear. I hadn't heard all of it, so thank you. And so now we're going to move on to carrying the work forward in new contexts, and we'll hear from Danielle.
Right, hi. Oh, just real quick, David, I think it might be that your phone is vibrating as you're talking. So maybe that will fix it. So hi, as I said, I'm an assistant professor at Cal State Long Beach. And I just took down a couple notes as David was talking, and that I want to add to what I had planned. And that is that there are some pretty significant differences between the CPRAT group at Santa Cruz and then where I find myself now. So I just want to make some of those differences really clear up front. So one of the things that I think made our research group at Santa Cruz really special, really unique, was that it was so consistent over so many years. So I was there for 7 years in my graduate program, and many of the folks I was there with were there for most of that time. And then Gina, of course, was there for that whole time. And so I was able to cultivate relationships with people that I was seeing every single week. And so that allowed us to develop, I think, a certain sort of culture and social climate that can be a little bit challenging to establish at an undergraduate institution. So Cal State Long Beach is quite large. We have about 37,000 students, and also a very diverse student body. So over half of our students are either first gen, students of color, or low income or financially insecure students. And like I said, it's an undergraduate teaching institution. So there's a relatively heavy teaching load as well. So I teach 3 classes every semester. And we also have 3 different graduate programs, master's programs in the department. So I also supervise graduate students in our master's in psychological research program. So in terms of my research space and how I've structured that, my students are primarily undergraduates right now. So I have anywhere from 4 to 8 undergraduate research assistants or thesis students every semester. And then right now I also have 2 master's level students. So that's, an important structural change from Santa Cruz, where you had people around for like 6+ years. I do not hold weekly lab meetings or research meetings. in part because of time and space restrictions, but we do have bi-weekly meetings, or we meet every other week for bigger projects, which are those that involve multiple students. So all of my research students are rarely all together in one place at one time. We sort of break out into different group meetings depending on the project. So one of my primary goals in that space is to create a sense of belonging that promotes really open and frequent communication. Again, because we're not necessarily meeting, as often as I would like. So I try to cultivate this sense of community by holding lab events. So for example, at the beginning of the semester, we have either a potluck or like a beach bonfire, and one of the students who's been in the lab for a while will take the lead on planning that, so that all of the students have a chance to meet each other a few times per semester. And then the focus of the lab meetings is similar to what Gina outlined. So it's shaped in part by the needs and interests of the students. So again, since these are mostly undergraduate and master's level students, they're really interested in graduate school preparation. So we talk at the beginning of the semester about what they would like to get out of their research assistantship, and I make sure that we schedule time to address their interests in professional development. And then I also will invite guest speakers via Skype or sometimes in person, many of whom were former CPRAT members or current, and they talk about how they are also carrying out this critical community psychology work in their own practices. And then I think that helps students to networking and learning about how to use these skills outside of the work that we're doing. We also start meetings with check-ins. If you've read our paper, we talk a lot about body talk and how we talked about what's going wrong or what's going well with our bodies. And we definitely do that in lab meetings. I tried not to necessarily create that as the norm, but it just sort of happened, which I think is great. So mostly, kind of talking about stress and how to deal with that. But we also talk a lot about experiencing and confronting and resisting racism and sexism and transphobia in the university. So, the psych major and department is fairly conventional here in terms of the courses students take. So they're really, it's the case that they're learning about critical psychology and community psychology through our research lab and not necessarily having that reinforced in their regular classes. So we do a lot of work on sort of reconciling their interests in a more critical approach with like whether they want to stay in psychology. And that's where most of our time is spent these days in lab meetings. So I will end there, and if we want to follow up on any of this in the discussion afterwards, I'm happy to do that.
Great, thanks, Danielle. And now we are going to switch over to Erin, who will also talk about carrying the work forward in her context.
Hi, like Danielle, I am also at a CSU, and it's a large university. We have over 30,000 students, and is similarly diverse. And one of the interesting things about our university, and this may be the same for you too, Danielle, is that more than half of every incoming class is transfer students coming from the California community college system. And so I'm just going to tell you a little bit about our current project and how that got started, because it kind of feeds into the structure of our lab currently. So it must have been the first week of school. When I first got here, I wasn't even unpacked in this office yet. And 2 students came in. One was a psychology student. I think maybe both of them were psychology students. And they said, we're with the Transfer Student Association. We want your help. You're a community psychologist. Transfer students make up over half of the population here. We get no resources. We have no sense of community. Can you help us? And so I was sort of trying to figure out Sacramento and start, making inroads in terms of doing community-based research with partners here. And all of a sudden I had a project. So this was my front burner project as soon as I got here. And by my second semester, I had formed a research team, and it was predominantly transfer students and one student who had been a transfer student who was also a graduate student. And so we started working on the transfer student project, doing some preliminary work with focus groups last spring. And then this fall, we are doing a participatory action research project with transfer students. And so this sort of feeds into the current structure of the research team. I have a sort of purposeful hierarchy in the research team. Again, somewhat similar to what Danielle was saying, we don't have students who are here for many, many years. And especially if you're working with transfer students, they're like only here for 2 years tops. So I have a leadership team, and that consists of 1 graduate student and 3 of the students that are still here who participated with me last semester. So they are kind of the facilitators of the participatory action research program. They take ethnographic field notes and all of that. And then we have 8 transfer students who are participating in the Photo Voice program. And so we have that structured a little bit more like a seminar. I meet weekly with the leadership team, and we come in and we do check-ins. Similarly, sometimes there's some body talk, but a lot of it tends to be checking in on how people are doing, just in terms of navigating the university and an increasingly difficult context in the US for a lot of the students in my research team. And then we meet weekly with the folks who are doing the Photo Voice team. The Photo Voice project, and we do check-ins with that group as well. And one story I wanted to share is that, we're still, I feel like it's taking a while to kind of warm up and feel comfortable sharing, but a lot of the focus in both of those meetings has been around relatedness and social support, emotional support, and sort of building a sense of community within the group. And so we had check-ins recently, and one of the students was experiencing multiple challenging moments, including a possible eviction, some issues with immigration paperwork, and a recent death of a friend. And in the check-in, that student kind of was like, I have all this stuff going on, and I'm glad we're here because it keeps me busy, and then ended their check-in. And then my research team, the leadership team, came back to me later and said, I don't know, I feel weird that we just kept moving on. I feel like we should have held the space for this student. And so I felt like that was kind of a nice, we went back and we talked about it. We sent a card. I felt like it was a nice indicator that that this kind of work is going on. So I think in the space, it's not as much, I don't feel like we're to the point where we're doing a lot of critically reflexive praxis, but there's a lot of understanding and support being fostered among students from a very marginalized background. So a lot of what they're facing and they're talking about relates to class and basic needs. We've had multiple tiers over that in the lab space, but also anti-immigrant rhetoric, racism, cis-sexism, and anti-trans sentiment, and that kind of stuff is all things that we're working with in the lab. And then I guess finally, I would just like to close out and talk about the one bit of ethics and reflexive praxis we've been working with lately in the group is that because they're doing photo voice, the transfer student participants are going out and they are taking photos, and sometimes they're taking photos that that include people. And so we've had a lot of conversation about taking photos that don't misrepresent people, and doing member checks with the people that they take the photos of. You know, of course, they're getting written permission to use the photo, but then the way that it's being presented and the narrative that students are writing about the photos, we're also doing checks with the people who are in the photos to make sure they're okay with how they're being represented in the photography. So I'll end it there.
Great. Thanks, Erin, and thanks, Danielle, as well. And so now we have plenty of time for discussion. So we said we'd have about 25 minutes, and that's about what we have. So great. So does anybody have any questions? And I know many of you are muted, so if you do have a question, please go ahead and unmute to ask your question.
I have a question for regarding photo voice, actually, more so than the reflexive settings that you're discussing. Those of you, I know that Gina, you use photo voice too, but those of you who use photo voice and are dealing with those ethics issues that were just being discussed about how the photo is actually used, not just getting permission to take it, but then how it's used and how it's interpreted. I just wanted to let you know that there was a really, Lauren Dario is the person I know. It's her sister, Laura Dario, is a photojournalist who has covered situations of war and trauma and refugee status around the world. And she just put out a book of her work, and she discusses those issues. What does she, because she has pictures in there, she has pictures of women. She has a very famous photo of a woman who had been raped in an armed conflict area, and she has a picture of her pregnant. And she talked about how that picture came to be and how the woman felt about it, and the discussions about how the photo was going to be used. So if you want some very, very real and times raw descriptions of how do you negotiate that environment, and how do you negotiate the use of those images, I thought that she had some, well, the photos are just beautiful, and then the stories speak directly to that.
That's great. Thank you. I want to check that out.
Okay, I had a question for you, and I'm not sure who this is best for. Maybe for Gina. In your design of these meeting sessions, how did you sort of decide on the pieces that best would be set within the structure that would reflect this anti-racist praxis? I guess, what are the components of it that you wanted to make sure got manifested in the structure of the setting?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I feel like it's one that maybe Erin, Danielle, and I can kind of tag team on, because I think it was mutually constructed and it wasn't necessarily only me who was figuring out what that should look like. I don't recall a time when we didn't have check-ins, but that might totally be possible. You know, now you're asking me what we were doing like 11 years ago. Erin, I think you said yes, you're on mute. So yeah, I think that that was always something that I found as important and interesting. And I don't know that I was necessarily reading what was in the literature as much as I was trying to focus on what felt right to me, which is maybe not the best way to be doing things, but just to be honest about that. So, and also from the beginning, we had a rotating structure. And I think that came, I think like all of us, including my own graduate students, when you're in graduate school, you see some things and you say, oh, I definitely want to do this. And then there are things you say, oh, I definitely want to do this differently, right? So, so I think that that came up for me as something that was important, because I wanted to make sure that we had a rotation so that everybody was getting some time and getting to spend some time in the way that they thought was going to be useful. And I know that for the graduate students, I think especially for the newer graduate students, that has been a challenge, because in academia, there's always the pressure to sort of perform and to perform well. And so I think, you know, the first couple of years, oh my gosh, it's my turn to take a slot here. What am I going to do? Am I going to look dumb? And so I really work hard, and maybe successfully, maybe not successfully. I guess David, Erin, and Danielle can tell you if it was successful or not. But I really work hard to make sure that they know that they can use that space however they want. And when I've had other graduate students come into our space from other spaces, oftentimes what's comfortable is them deciding that I'm going to do something, and which is fine, you know. So I see that kind of transition for newer students, whether they be brand new graduate students or new to our space, where they will say, oh, well, we want you, Gina, to talk about blah, blah, blah. And then I just do that. And I think over time, everybody sees, you know, I think it's sort of like shocking when a student's like, I don't know what to do. And I'm like, well, why don't you just use this as writing time? And they're like, oh my gosh, we could do that. Right. So I spend a lot of time saying what's most important is that this space is useful for you. This is your time, and however you define that. And I think there have been jokes from Erin and others like, well, I think we should just do yoga during this time. And nobody's ever quite, you know, done that. But, you know, maybe they're kind of pushing to see what the boundary is. But so I would say all of those things, which is just more of, I guess, a felt experience connected to the literature, more so than me reading the literature and saying, oh, this is definitely how we should do it. But others can chime in.
I guess I would just add that, yeah, I think we always had check-ins. And I don't know that everyone was always feeling comfortable to check in. And I think that that's an important thing to, I don't know, just acknowledge that, you know, maybe not everyone's always going to feel like they want to share anything. And I guess I would just also add that I've been in a lot of spaces that have used the check-ins. I was actually recently at a dinner party with a friend, and everybody was like, oh, it's time to do check-ins. And this group of friends that I was invited into, and I was like, wait, what are check-ins? You know, is it the same thing that I know about? And so I think it's a practice that's used often in like more non-hierarchical organizing settings. And I liked that I was in a lot of settings like that simultaneously, and maybe sharing some things with one group and other things with other groups.
So I do have another question if no one else wants to comment on that one. But I also don't want to hog all the time. So if somebody else wants to pop in, let me know.
I did have a question. And it was mentioned that some of the students were first-timers, generations for families. And I wanted to know, did you notice them bonding with each other due to having that same relationship or experience? Or did they share that among each other?
I feel like this would be better answered by one of the graduate students or former graduate students. I will say, just to sort of start off, that all of the students in our research space are students of color and or first gen college students. So that part is shared across everybody, including me as a first gen college student.
All right, hopefully, I don't know if the audio issue has been resolved. Do I sound okay? Okay, good. Yeah, I would say that we are able to have conversations about that in the space, but a lot of times the space just serves as a launching pad where we, having identified each other as other first generation students or students of color with whom we have shared values and we've engaged in these conversations in this space, we take that then outside of the space and are able to start other discussions, other conversations. I know that in this space, we've talked about psychology graduate student-wide meetings that we were going to be having, and just kind of using this as a place to brainstorm and think about what kinds of things do we as students of color, first-generation grad students, need to navigate the psychology department, UCSC at large, and how can we support each other in doing that. So yeah, I would say that those bonds definitely happen.
I have another question that's related to that. I know of an instance where a graduate student was out with her cohorts. It wasn't in a planned space. And they were talking, and a couple of the graduate students were making negative comments about undocumented students, including making comments about how my family doesn't get all the free services that they get, that kind of thing. And this woman was undocumented. Her family was undocumented. She was in it was a very, as you all know, it was a very emotional time for her, and still is, because of the stress. So have any of you, with the check-ins, have any of you had a conversation like that occur where you might know that things that are being said are specifically hurtful to a person with something that they haven't shared with the group? How would you negotiate a situation like that? Or let's make the question broader. Does it ever happen that you're having check-ins and people's feelings get hurt?
I would say, there's definitely always that possibility. And one thing that we've talked about, for the most part, I think we've been fortunate in that the members of this space are trying to be very cognizant of what they're saying and how other people might relate to what they're saying. But one thing that we've talked about as a general value and or a general practice, and a lot of us have used in other spaces, whether that be in the Youth Participatory Action Program that most of us have worked with, and other similar spaces, is just the practice of calling in. And that, sometimes people say things, and whether or not they intended a certain way, it had a certain impact. And that impact is important to give credence, to give consideration of also. And so giving feedback, not necessarily with the goal of shaming someone into appropriate behavior, but giving feedback with the the prioritization of relationship and saying we are in relationship in this space. For us to have a supportive and productive relationship, I need you to know that what you said hurt me in a certain way. So I would say that feedback is important, and we definitely try and put feedback, we try to prioritize feedback, but we do it with a certain goal, and that's the relationship.
Thanks, David. And I would also add to that, we really try, I don't know that we've had this conversation explicitly, but the way that things have happened is that with the check-ins, it's really a focus on, you know, like my check-in is a focus on me as an individual and what I'm going through. So it's not about sort of like my feelings and thoughts about other things in the world unless I'm bringing that up as it affects me. So it's, you know, there's a lot of I statements, not you statements or they statements kinds of things. And we did have a situation last year where we had a relatively new graduate student who felt like a lot of the check-in time was focused really on things that weren't going well. And it was starting to kind of take on a, I'm going to call it, like Eve Tuck calls it, a damage discourse. And this person was already feeling a little bit like they weren't sure that psychology and graduate school was for them. And so they talked, I don't recall now if they brought it up with me first or if they just brought it up to the group. They might have just brought it up to the group and asked for a little bit of a shift where we could also really try to spend time talking about positive things that had happened over the last week and celebrate those things as well. And so I think that, you know, because they were able to frame it in the sense of like, this is making it even harder for me to be here. And then I know that I said, well, we should really think about Eve Tuck and the damage discourse and what that means. I think that we spent some explicit time sort of making some shifts in that. And then David could speak to if we're still doing that this year. I mean, we're on the quarter system, so we've just started meeting again pretty recently. So I'm not sure if you feel like it's come up again, but that's another thing that I would add to David's excellent answer.
Yeah, I would. Thank you for adding that. I would say that we've continued it. I don't know if we continue it as formally, but just, and also this quarter's been really weird in the way things have been broken up. There's been a lot of times where we haven't met due to other occurrences on campus or due to some of us being gone. And so it's been kind of patchwork so far this quarter, but there still has been a focus on, okay, what are some of the wins, some of the things we can celebrate, and thinking about too how this space overlaps with the psychology department at large, and our area has been trying to do more things to create a sense of community and collaboration amongst the social psychology area. So we've been having socials, we call them, and even just getting to talk about, okay, what is it that we want to do to have fun together has been a way to think about, okay, what are some of the exciting things about life?
Hi, I have a question. First of all, thank you for your wonderful presentation. We were, before you, a group of graduate students also reflecting on the practice competencies. So it was very interesting to hear students as well. Thank you. I have a question in terms of first, if all of you who talked, some of you are now also professors at universities. So I wonder if they were part of the group before as graduate students and now you are out there in other places applying what you did together?
Yeah, I can start. Yes, I was a graduate student in the CPRAT research team, and a lot of the structure has, you know, continued here at Sac State, and I think that, like, you know, one of the things that David was talking about with the calling in, that has become a common community agreement in my classrooms and also among my research teams. So yeah, I'm hoping to recreate what seems appropriate for a very different group of students.
Thank you. And the other question is, how do you get to sign up to participate in this work? Is it voluntary? Do you just invite all students, or is it selected? How do you get them to participate?
Is your question about undergraduate research assistants for?
Well, in all cases, you know, I mean, I think for graduate student participation, there may have been some different way, but I wonder how does it been, you know, determine who gets to play in these labs, or do they recruit themselves, or do you invite them?
Yeah, I can start out with an answer to that. So at UC Santa Cruz, when graduate students are admitted to the program, we have a pretty strict mentorship model. So they come in to work with an individual faculty member. So my graduate students are definitely in the space. And then as David was alluding to, the space is also open to other students. So for example, we have 2 people who attend fairly regularly at this point who are not my graduate students. One of them, when she applied, was interested in working with her advisor now, and also had mentioned me and had some interest in kind of more community psychology kinds of things. So her advisor and I talked, and we agreed that that I could invite her into the space. And so then I talk with the current graduate students to see if they think that's appropriate. And then if so, that person receives an invitation. And we have another person who is the only graduate student in that research space with their advisor. And so we invited him into our space as well, so that he could have more of a group feel. So there have also been other students who have asked me if they could come. And in those cases, what we do is I bring it to the group. And I don't think the group has ever said no. Usually if a new person comes in sort of partway through the quarter or the academic year, we'll go back through kind of our agreements as a way to sort of help them understand the social climate of the space.
Thank you.
For my students, my graduate students, our master's level, they also indicate which faculty they would like to work with. So we have a mentor model similar to doctoral programs. And that's how we find each other. And then for undergraduates, I've really never had to say like to a class that I'm recruiting. Usually students just sort of have been able to find me. Either they're taking a class with me and they are really excited about this approach to psychology. So they ask about opportunities, or they, current students will tell other students or friends of theirs, and I'll meet them that way. I do have an application that I have students fill out, and the top part of the application has a paragraph explaining my orientation to research and what community psychology is and what social justice oriented research looks like. And I make my expectations really explicit. And I think for some students who aren't into that, they self-select out, and then those who are left are really excited about that kind of work and end up in my lab. And that's why I tend to have a lot of research assistants, because I feel terrible turning anyone away who's interested in this. And also, I have plenty of things for for people to do. So that's how mine work.
Do they get paid?
The master's students can't, there are a few mechanisms for them to get paid, including I have a small grant that pays some summer stipends, and then there are also graduate assistantships that they can have. Undergraduate students do not get paid, but they do get course credit.
Oh, great, thank you.
We have about 3 minutes left. I just want to ask and make a space for anybody who hasn't yet asked a question if they want to. If not, then we have now about 2 minutes left. Does anybody have one last burning question?
I do. I'm just curious. I know, David, you mentioned that the space changed because the people have changed. And so in my mind, I imagine that you were in that space sort of before these changes had occurred. So I want a little bit about sort of what the space looked like before you implemented these changes and then what it looked like after.
So a lot of, I think, to say what it looks like, it's very relative. And part of that is because of the fluidity of my identity during the course of my participation in it. So from my perspective, when I first came in, everyone else knew what they were doing and I didn't. Like, that's the kind of the way that I saw it. And I think that's one of the reasons why it was hard for me to participate. So I was like, well, they know what they're doing. I don't. I have nothing really to give them to help them do their expertise better, and I would just sound ridiculous if I tried. And that was, I know that is very likely not true, but that's kind of what was going on in my head. As opposed to now, as my identity has shifted, and I've seen that, yeah, you know, they are very smart, capable, intelligent experts in their fields, and I also have something to say and something to contribute, and it's valuable in this space. And so I don't know that the shifts are structural so much as in terms of just relational understandings of each other and the openness to acknowledge that someone else can be really good at what they do and you also can be increasingly good at what you do. I'm not gonna go so far as to say like I'm great, but I'm getting better. That's one thing I brought up in one of our meetings. And it was also funny, I think, having younger students come in to hear myself say things to encourage them, like, oh yeah, I guess that is true. And for one of our new members who was an undergrad and now they're a grad student participating in our space, and they were feeling kind of stressed about the experience. And what I was telling them is, you know, sometimes you're not gonna do things to the degree that you want to. Sometimes it's not gonna shape up the way that you imagined it. But the key with this is just recognizing that I am better today than I was yesterday. I am farther today than I was yesterday. And so I think understandings and I guess the shifts have been conversational and relational more than structural. I guess that's, if that answers the question.
Great, thanks so much. And I see that we are at the end of our time. So thanks everyone for joining us. And I hope to see you all at the next biennial. And thanks to Erin and David and Danielle for participating too. And to Jean for setting everything up. And to Tiffany for her feedback early on.
Thanks for doing the work to come together.
Thank you, Gina.
Thank you.
You all at the biennial.
Yeah, see you soon. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Bye, thanks.